When you see somebody else's coffee setup, it can be really tempting to think, I'd really like a setup like that. That is so cool what they're doing. I would just love that. And this can be true whether it's a friend setup, your favorite cafe even, and especially this happens with setups you see online. And one of the most common questions that I get in my DMs is, Justin, what is your go-to piece of equipment for X or Y? But the truth is, you don't need to buy what I use. And more than that, you might not even like what I use. I'm always happy to share that, but what you see from YouTubers definitely isn't something that you need to enjoy a great cup of coffee at home, or isn't something that you should be working towards as a goal. Because here's the thing that I find the most exciting about the coffee landscape right now. And it's that cafe quality coffee no longer takes cafe quality dollars to enjoy in your house. This used to be a pay to play thing. And today, more than ever, you can get really, really great coffee from extremely affordable equipment. That begs the question though, if that's true, then why do so many coffee setups that I see online look so extreme? Here's some important context to this conversation. A lot of the gear that you will see on my channel gets sent to me by a manufacturer. Now, I don't cover everything that I get sent, and for the things that I do cover, manufacturers don't have any input into what I say about that thing. What it does mean, though, is that I am constantly surrounded by a lot of coffee equipment in a way that just is not normal for most home coffee brewers. And on top of that, a lot of the things that I use actually week to week are actually used for benchmarking or testing things against other things. Sometimes I'm using something often not because it's what I prefer, but because it's the most useful standard for comparison. Now, there is another segment of people which are kind of high-powered enthusiasts, which spend a lot of money to kind of push into the last 5% of coffee brewing. And when these people post their setups online, they're often very extravagant and they get a lot of attention as well. I think in any case, those extreme setups are somewhat outside of the norm and even beyond what is really needed to make great coffee. So this kind of brings us to the core issue. And I will share what I use because I think it's interesting and helpful and I get asked about it a lot. But in my opinion, taking what somebody else is doing and prescribing that into your reality is not actually always the most helpful thing to do. And it can actually leave you having spent a lot of money and sometimes only having a marginally different cup of coffee than you're already having. If you're just getting started out in this and you want to see what I would recommend to actually get started, I actually just released a video on that, so I would recommend you check that out. But that being said, I am, of course, always happy to talk gear and share what I use and why that is. So today we're going to look at all that. I'm going to talk about filter, I'm going to talk about espresso, I'm going to talk about travel, and the stuff that actually gets used around here on, let's say, a weekly basis, with some disclaimers along the way. Let's talk about filter coffee first. Now, I have made some changes to how I make filter coffee in the last year. I have this little leather pad that I keep my little pour over set on. This is actually just a mouse pad from a company called Ugmonk, very small, lifestyle company. Love the work that Jeff at Ugmonk is doing. And on here, I have the Timemore Black Mirror Duo scale. We'll come back to this, but it's got this scale surface here with this little arm for your pour over dripper. And then over here, I have two Melodrip stands. And in one of them, I keep the glass stir stick that comes with the Melodrip and the Melodrip itself. Don't use the Melodrip for every brew, but I like to have it available if I want what it provides. Next, I have my carafe. I actually use the setup to make this cup of coffee. This one is a St. Anthony Industries carafe. It's kind of low profile. Sometimes I'll use the Icosa Brewhouse Cyclone as well. Basically, what I'm doing with this is whatever brewer I have up here, I'll take it off and I'll put it on this first Melodrip stand and I'll pre-wet the filter so that the water is actually in here and not in my carafe. Then I'll put it back on, make my cup of coffee, and then when I'm done, I'll put it back on this and let any last little drips kind of just drip out into that. It's kind of nice because I don't have a sink over there on that bar. Again, context dependent. This is kind of the setup that I use for my daily filter brew, but you'll probably be wondering, what do I use for a dripper? And yeah, this is a bit of a problem for me. I really move around when it comes to using a dripper. I use a plastic V60 when I want to benchmark stuff, which is actually quite often. And then when it comes to personal brewing, I'll rotate through a lot of the different ones that I have. I have a couple limited V60s from Hario, Taiwan. Really, that's about material and aesthetics. The Cafec Flower 01 size is a really nice dripper that I use often. Same with the Aurea Baby 01 if I want a flat bottom. The Melodrip Column is a dripper that's a little bit more involved, but I actually really enjoy using that. The brews are very nice off of that. The Ceramic UFO makes some appearances, as well as plastic origamis, Konos. I use a lot of different drippers. Do you need to do that? No. Sometimes I just do that because they're there, and sometimes it's because I'm actually looking to compare them to each other. Lastly, off to the side, I keep one of these. This is from a company called Digitized Fluid or Dye Fluid or DI Fluid. It's called their R2, and it's a refractometer. And this uses light to measure how much stuff is actually diluted into your coffee. Basically, it tells you the strength, which can be very useful if you're changing things very often and looking to see what results that had. I did this actually on my morning brew. I tried a bit of a different approach, and I looked at what impact that had using this thing. Now, would I be taking those measurements all the time if I wasn't reviewing gear and comparing a lot of different equipment? Maybe not. But because I am doing that, very helpful. Just one issue. Actually taking that measurement and making calculations can be a little tedious. And when it comes to my personal brewing, you know, when the kids are running around or whatever, I can be a little lazy. So doing a pour over brew and then trying to measure out how much liquid is actually in here after you've done all that stuff, which is something you need to do for this measurement, is something that I find pretty annoying. And thankfully, this scale does that automatically. It gives me the beverage weight at the end of my brew, so I can just plunk that into the app with the refractometer reading and know what my extraction was very quickly. Now, when it comes to just fit and finish, I actually probably prefer the Fellow Tally Pro scale a little bit more, but because this feature is so useful, this is the one that lives out. Now, kettle-wise, I'm almost always using the Fellow Stag Pro Studio. Again, I've used the Stags since way before I was a YouTuber. I'm just like them, I'm familiar with them, and the trim level of the Pro Studio is just a really nice kettle. Does the trim level have any impact on how the coffee tastes? Zero. Now let's talk about grinders very quickly. And this is another area where I'm going to say you really don't need to do what I do or follow what you see from a lot of coffee people making videos online that have all these different grinders. You can make really, really, really good coffee, especially compared to like a decade ago with something like an Espresso Q Air or a King Grinder K6. The Timor grinders are also really great for the price. Lots of people choose to move up from there, but you do move into the land of diminishing returns pretty quickly. That disclaimer given, here's what I use. When it comes to all-around grinders that are capable of doing both filter and espresso, I tend to stick either between the Espresso K Ultra or the Comandante C40. If I'm looking for a high clarity cup, the cup that I actually prefer, and this cup of coffee was brewed with it, is the Pietro. I don't actually use the Pietro the most often. More often I'm using the ZP6. And the reason for that is because it's a much more commonly used grinder. So I want to be very familiar with the experience people are having with that grinder and how that gets reflected across different drippers. So right there, we have 4 different hand grinders that I'm using on a pretty regular basis. I do have a lot of other hand grinders here, and I find what happens is I'm constantly like pulling those out, doing some tests with them, doing some comparative brews, and then putting them away again. But those 4 kind of smaller form factor hand grinders are the ones that I am using the most often for filter coffee. Okay, let's talk about electric grinders for filter coffee. And the one that I use the most often is very easily the Zerno Z1. The burr that I will use the most often for filter coffee on that grinder is the SSP UMV1, the brew burrs with the slow feed auger. Sometimes I'll throw in the cast version 3 in there, but most of the time it's the UMV1. Again, a very high clarity burr. We'll talk about espresso in a minute, but just a really quick aside here. The Zerno Z1 and the upcoming Zerno Z2, they're both kind of on the upper end of the prosumer coffee grinder market. For my purposes, I like that the Z1 uses the 64 millimeter burr set because it's such a commonly used burr size with a ton of different options. And it is just a really good operating environment for those burrs, allowing them to kind of do what they're going to do without a lot of other stuff getting in the way. Beyond that, it's actually very quick to change the burrs in those grinders, which again is something that's very useful as I'm reviewing and comparing a lot of different equipment. So I actually have two Z1s, one black and one white, and very often I'm changing the burrs in them, trying a couple things, and then changing them back. Now, having two grinders like that is definitely out of the spectrum of what I would say is normal for even very into this coffee people. Now, let's come back to grinders for espresso. And I've noticed something very interesting about myself here. I tend to have one of two modes when I'm making espresso. Mode one, I'm looking for something that tastes great, fast, convenient, dependable, predictable, cafe quality. Often this can be first thing in the morning, or if company's over and I need to make a lot of drinks really quickly. When I'm in that zone, it's not really a question of what I'm going to use. It's been on my bar for almost 2 years. I'm going to reach for the La Marzocco Linea Mini. Now, the Mini is very interesting because it really set the tone for what flat profile espresso machines should look like. It does that style of espresso very well. It is very dominant in the industry. You can see them in small commercial environments, pop-up cafes, that kind of thing. It really has become a bit of a gold standard. And as a product reviewer, it's very helpful in that regard because I can compare other things against it and see how they stack up. Now, on top of that, we also do pop-ups for Got Coffee Co. So for all those reasons, the Mini makes a good fit for when we're in that mode of brewing. Would I use it if I wasn't doing those two things? Probably not. If I even wanted to get into a La Marzocco, I would probably do a Micra. There are a lot of other really great machines that make fantastic espresso as well. Now, my second mode of making espresso is very different. And I am going to come back to the grinders here, but my second mode is when I'm looking for something very slow, very tactile. I'm looking to maybe try a brand new coffee or maybe try a coffee only one time on espresso. I'm looking for a slow, quiet experience and a very fast dial in with a great result. And when I'm in that mode and I have a little bit more space, I will basically without exception lean to the Cafe Lot robot. I've talked a lot about the robot on this channel. I think that if you have the appetite for manual espresso, and not everybody does, there's a pretty strong argument that it's very close to an endgame espresso maker in a very different way than the Mini is. I have a lot of good things to say about it. Now, whichever mode I find myself in, I find I can take a couple different approaches. Number one, I want a very blended and favorable shot, easy to dial in, but without overbearing body. And when I'm looking for that style of shot in either machine, I use a conical grinder. On the Mini, it's almost always the Weber Key, or the robot, it's the HG2, which they both use the same burr set from Mazzer. It's an 83mm conical burr, very bimodal distribution. Without getting into what that means, it's going to give you a very round, forgiving profile, but it does so in a way that the body is not overbearing and heavy. It's very enjoyable burr, actually. Now, if I'm looking for that similar flavor profile, but in a flat burr, which sometimes I'm looking for, I'll use one of the Zernos with a SSP HU burr. It's kind of the burr that is the closest to that in SSP's line. But sometimes I want a little bit more clarity, a little bit more flavor presentation, or a more modern style of espresso. And when I want that and I'm using the Mini, I will often use the SSP MP burr loaded in the Zerno Z1. I've got a whole video on how to choose the right SSP 64mm burr for you, so I'll link that down below, but on this machine, I almost always am using that 64mm MP. Now on the robot, just because of how it works, there's a lot more flexibility, so I'll kind of flip-flop around all the different SSP burrs just to see how they present differently, knowing that I'll likely be able to pull a good shot with them because of how the robot is designed. As far as espresso scales, on the robot, I'm using the Buku Mini scale, and on the Mini, I'm using the La Marzocco co-branded Akaya Lunar. And as far as espresso cups go, nothing that we have gets used more than these. These are Kruve Propels. This is actually the Daddy Got Coffee Propel Server edition, collaboration between myself and Kruve. I asked for them to put this little spout on here. This is what I use for espresso glasses almost every time. Now, before we get into travel, does anybody really need an espresso setup like that with several different burr sets, flipping them out, conical and flat burr on both flat profile and manual lever espresso machines. Absolutely not. My hope in that is to help you find the way to the one combination that is going to be best suited to the way that you like to drink coffee. Now, when it comes to travel, another thing that I get asked often about, you may assume that I would opt for a very durable, very practical coffee brewing setup. And that is not at all true. I go and I pull out my Weber Workshop's Bird flight case. I pack up my Bird into that with a hand grinder and some coffee, and I head off to an Airbnb or wherever we happen to be going. A couple of reasons why. It makes good coffee, but it is a really nice piece of equipment to use, which is something that I can really appreciate and enjoy when I'm on vacation. It's a very zen-like actually experience just even using it. Can you have really great coffee on the road with an AeroPress and an EasyPresso Q-Air grinder? Absolutely. And those are the things that I tend to use on a weekly basis when I am making coffee. A lot of it is highly dependent upon my personal context of like evaluating and testing and reviewing different pieces of equipment and how I compare those things to one another. There's actually a whole other set of things that I use actually to take measurements to do with this stuff that go a few steps beyond what the refractometer does in different ways. I think for anybody who is out there and seeing coffee setups online that are just crazy, it's important to recognize that the people who are making that content are often trying to achieve different things than maybe even they would at home as casual brewers not doing any of that stuff. So if you've been curious about what is the actual gear that I use and why I use that, that's why. Don't let that take away from the setup that you currently have, because so many setups these days are so much better than they were when I was starting for way less money. I'm going to leave a couple other videos around here that I mentioned that I think could be really helpful in that conversation. You know, what would I do if I was starting over today? How to choose different SSP burrs for your specific use, how to find the right hand grinder. I think if you're out there and you're seeing all these different crazy coffee setups, it's important to remember that today more than ever, you can get a better quality setup for less money. You really don't need to go to the nth degree like a lot of the setups you'll see out there. So I hope that video was helpful. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.